So today we're going to look at what it takes to actually swap between wires and bolt-on wheels on the Mgbgt. Well, let's go. So the way we're going to do it today is the way that's been done for years using all original factory parts, and that is swapping the whole rear axle out and then the front hubs. You can't just use these because the width of the rear axles are different between wire wheel and bolt-on wheel cars. And we will get into some differences between the rear axles later in the video. Now the car that's getting the bolt-on wheels and that the customer is going to be keeping is the 67 here. If you watched my last video, you'll know that. And this car has been sitting for quite some time. I have no idea, but as some people have noticed, these are some quite old tires. They're old BF Goodrich, was it Silvertowns bias plies. So these are quite old. So this, we have no idea how long, I have no idea how long the car's been sitting, but looking at the brakes, it's obviously been sitting for a long time. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be swapping, the hubs, rotors, calipers, and everything from the other car onto this car, because we know that the other car had been running in the last 4 to 5 years, so the calipers won't be froze up and all that on that. I am not going to do this as a detailed step-by-step instructional video on how to do it. It's more or less just going to be an overview of what's all involved. So I'm not going to show every step of taking the rear axle and everything out of the car. It's more or less just knowing that the whole rear axle has to come out. So one of the things I will say is, though, just remember, before you even start turning any bolts, get in there and soak every bolt down you think you're going to have to loosen with your favorite penetrating oil, preferably a day ahead of time, or in case of something that's been sitting as long as this, a couple of days wouldn't hurt. Now in this case, since these are both GTs, they both have the tube type axle on them. Now if these were Roadsters, the 67 would have the banjo style in it, and then the 69 would have the tube type. That does create a few extra issues because you will have to swap over the U-bolts and U-bolts, shock mounts, all the plates, buffers, all of this stuff switches over because the tube diameter is smaller on the banjo type axle. And the other thing is the e-brake or parking brake cable is different, not only between the two different styles of rear axles, but also between wire wheel and disc wheel. So you want to take all of that with it as an assembly from one car to another. To take this apart, we're going to take this thing whole as assembly. We just need to get the e-brake cable disconnected from the mechanism up here. There's a block here with a nut inside by the seat. There's actually a little clip here that has a little nut inside as well, and then a clip here holding it, and then we can just drop that out and take it with it. And then take the drive shaft out, and that's another thing. If you're switching between tube type axle and the banjo style, the drive shaft length is a little bit different because the length from the center line to the flange is a little bit different. So you would want to take the drive shaft and all. So once you get the drive shaft loose, and we need to get the U-bolts loose, the straps, and get these loose, get the shock, you can swing these away. And then get the brake line loose, preferably from right up here. And then take the rear shackles loose. And then as long as you have enough room getting high enough, you can actually swing this down while supporting this, and then drop this out and get it out as a complete assembly, and then take it to the other car. So we do that with both cars, and then I'll show you the difference between the two axles between wire wheel and bolt-on. And I almost forgot, since the exhaust is broke off right here, you do have to take the exhaust and get it out of the way to do this as well. And quick tip, when taking these loose, the straps loose, these nuts here are almost always seized and they give you lots of trouble. If they don't want to come loose easily, don't fight them. Cut the nut off. A nut splitter, even buying a nut splitter, is cheaper than repairing that if you break it off. So now we're going to look at the difference in the rear ends. This is the one out of the 67. This is the one out of the 69. And then this is actually one I had laying outside from a 62 to 67 Roadster. So the early Roadsters up to 67 carried over the same rear axle from the MGA, virtually unchanged, other than gear ratios. So if you saw one of these earlier ends just laying on the ground like this, and you want to know whether it's from a MGA or an early B, you really just look right here. This denotes the gears. It has 11 teeth on the pinion, 43 on the ring. You divide that out, it's a 390 gear ratio. The MGA, all your 1500s and 1600s would have 10 teeth and 43, making it a 430 gear ratio. Now, if it's from a Mark II, like this chassis I'm working on here, then they have 1041, which is a 410 gear ratio. These used to be highly sought after for racing years ago, and there's not that many of them around, so they used to be pretty valuable. I don't know anymore if they are, though. So only the Roadsters use this rear end. All GTs used the tube type axle because the factory, after putting together the first prototypes, thought that there was too much gear noise coming through the interior on the GT, and they really wanted the GT to be a nice refined grand tourer, something you could really put a lot of miles in across Europe, and that's what they were going for. So then a lot of people referred to them as the poor man's Aston Martin, and that's exactly what they were trying to build pretty much. These, being the cast center section, were a little quieter, and they were determined that this was much better for the GT. So all GTs ended up with these. Now, what's the difference between the bolt-on wheel and the wire wheel? The width of the rear axle. So if we measure across back plate to back plate, you'll see that the bolt-on rear axle is 48 inches wide, whereas the wire wheel is 46 1/4 from back plate to back plate. So you can't just take the hubs off of one of these and just bolt onto one of these, throw your wheels on and go, because your wheels won't fit under the rear wheel arches. It pushes them out way too far because it's an 1 3/4 difference. The offset of the wire wheel is different than the bolt-on wheel. And the difference in the width puts the wheels in the same spot. So that's why we swap rear axles over. Now, if you were dealing with a Roadster that had this rear axle in it, and swapping between maybe a GT or a later Roadster that had this rear axle in it, you need to swap the whole drive shaft and all with it, because this distance here is different. If you measure this one here, we're approximately 11 inches to the face of the flange here. Or this one here is less than 10 inches, closer to 9.5. So that's a big enough difference that you need to swap the drive shafts with them if you're swapping between styles of axles. So because of that width difference, that's why we need to swap the e-brake cables over as well, because they do not interchange. And if I remember correctly, yeah, the cables on these are actually a different length than these as well. So I'd have to look up in the catalog again, but I think you still need to swap cables, even switching from rear end style to rear end style. All right, now I've gotten my hands dirty. I've got the rear axles swapped between the two cars where they're ready to just do some final tightening, hook up the brake lines, brake cables, things like that. Now, when you do that, always put new nylocks on the U-bolts and the drive shaft, especially the drive shaft, because they will come loose on you if you reuse them. So now we want to look at the front here. Basically, the front is pretty much as easy as just swapping the hubs out. You're basically just the same as when you do a brake job. You're going to take the brake caliper off, take all the wheel bearings apart, pop it all off as an assembly, and then you can swap it on the other car. But of course, you should always take the wheel bearings apart, clean them, check the clearances, make sure we got the right clearances and it's not too sloppy or too tight. Repack the wheel bearings, put new seals, all that stuff. But the dust cap on a wire wheel car, it's down in here and people have trouble getting a hold of them. And if you just go in there with a pair of pliers, you tear up the threads. I had found this just in with some stuff I got one. I don't even know where it came from, some scrap metal. It was already welded together just like this. I'm like, that make a perfect puller. So I just tacked on a 5/16 24 nut on the end of it. And you can just go in here, screw it right on the end here and pull that right out. Makes it really nice and easy. All right, so now we've got the Minilites onto the 67 and we got the wire wheels onto the 69. I also ended up swapping the hatches over and the bonnets for her. Kind of starting to look a bit like Christmas cars, but 'tis the season, so it works. So that's the basics of what it takes to do the wire wheel, disc wheel swap, either direction you want to go.